The Ural Mountains in February are a different kind of cold from the cold that most people know. They are a cold of a specific and total character, a cold that comes from the north, across the Siberian plain, without interruption, without the moderating influence of any body of water or any significant topography to slow or warm it. A cold that arrives in the dead of night with a clarity and a thoroughness that turns breath to vapor instantly and makes the stars above the peaks, which are very bright and very close, look like chips of ice suspended in a black sky that has itself become a physical presence pressing down on the landscape below. In February of 1959, the northern Urals were at approximately -30 degrees Celsius on a calm night, and considerably colder when the wind moved. They were a place where experience and preparation, and the specific knowledge of survival in extreme conditions, were not optional equipment, but the minimum required for the journey to end without catastrophe. The rescue team that crested the slope of Kolatsiakhl on the 26th of February, 1959, were experienced people. They knew this terrain, and they knew this cold, and they knew, in the general way of people who have signed up for a rescue mission in conditions like these, that what they were looking for was either a group of stranded hikers or something that had gone wrong in a way they did not want to specify too precisely in their own minds before they found it. They had been searching for several days. The party they were looking for had been due to send a telegram from the settlement of Vizhai on the 12th of February and had not. Their families were waiting. The university that had organized the expedition was waiting. The weather had been bad enough in the interim period to explain a delay, and everyone who was capable of hoping was hoping that that was all it was. It was not all it was. What the rescue team found when they reached the altitude where the tent had been pitched was something that, in the more than 6 decades since, has not been fully explained to the satisfaction of the people who have spent the most time and the most intellectual effort trying to understand it. It was half collapsed, one side pushed down into the snow, its structure distorted. It was covered in a layer of accumulated snowfall. When it had been cut open from the inside, the fabric slashed in at least 2 places by a blade operated from within, as though the people inside had needed to exit the tent with a rapidity that did not allow for finding the door. The tent was empty. 9 pairs of footprints in the snow led away from the tent, down the slope toward the tree line, approximately 1.5 kilometers distant. The footprints were not the footprints of people wearing proper winter boots. They were the footprints of socked feet, of feet in a single layer of protection against the cold. Some of them were bare feet. 9 people who were professionally experienced in winter mountain survival had left a tent that contained their equipment and their clothing and their food in temperatures that kill unprotected people in minutes, and had walked, in socked feet, down a mountain slope into the dark. Whatever had driven them out of that tent, in the middle of a February night in the northern Urals, in -30 degrees, without their boots, the investigation that followed never fully established. The 9 hikers, who did not come home from the northern Urals in February of 1959, were students and young professionals from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, which is the city now called Yekaterinburg. They were, by any measure available to the investigation that followed their deaths, a group of serious and experienced people who had chosen the outdoors with deliberation and had prepared for it with care. They were not novices making amateur mistakes. They were people who knew what they were doing in conditions that kill the inexperienced without warning or ceremony. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old and the leader of the expedition, a radio engineering student who had been organizing and leading hiking and skiing expeditions since he was a teenager, who had designed his own radio equipment, and who was known among the hiking community of Sverdlovsk as someone whose competence in the mountains was matched by his meticulous approach to planning and preparation. His friends and colleagues described him as calm and capable, someone who did not panic and who thought clearly under pressure. He had planned this expedition carefully across the preceding months, had established the route and the schedule and the equipment list, and had selected his team with the awareness of someone who understood that the northern Urals in February were not a place where wishful thinking about other people's capabilities could be indulged. The expedition was classified as Category 3, the highest difficulty rating in the Soviet hiking classification system. It required exactly the kind of experienced, capable team that Dyatlov had assembled. Zinaida Kolmogorova was 22 years old, a fourth-year student at UPI, one of the most experienced female hikers in the hiking club, known for her warmth and her competence in equal measure. People who knew her described someone who was good at the outdoors, in the specific, practical way of someone who has done a lot of it, and who has absorbed the specific knowledge that the doing produces. Someone whose presence on a difficult expedition was reassuring rather than worrying. She was known to be cheerful in difficult conditions, which is a quality that experienced expedition leaders value above most others, because cheerfulness in difficult conditions is not a performance, but a resource, a thing that spreads from person to person, and that sustains the group's capacity to continue. Rustem Slobodin was 23 years old, a mechanical engineer, the only member of the group who had already completed his degree rather than still being a student. He was thoughtful and methodical, the kind of person who checks things twice before deciding they are done, whose preparedness in practical matters complemented the group's social and organizational strengths. He had significant hiking experience and was regarded as one of the more reliably capable members of the group. Yuri Doroshenko was 21 years old, one of the younger members of the group, a student at UPI who had somewhat less experience than the others. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, enthusiastic and willing, someone who worked hard to compensate for what he lacked in accumulated experience. He had a reputation for being strong physically, which in the context of a winter mountain expedition with heavy packs and difficult terrain mattered considerably. Yuri Krivonishenko was 23 years old, an engineer who had graduated from UPI the previous year and was working at a closed nuclear facility called Chelyabinsk 40, a detail that would acquire significance in the investigation that followed the deaths. He was known as the group's musician, someone who played the mandolin around the campfire and who brought a quality of lightness and entertainment to long evenings in difficult conditions. Alexander Kolevatov was 24 years old, the second oldest of the students, and one of the most experienced members of the group. He had worked in Moscow before returning to Sverdlovsk to complete his degree and had, like Krivonishenko, a connection to the Soviet nuclear industry, having worked at a classified research institute in the capital before his return. He was methodical and careful, regarded by the others as dependable. Nicolas Thibault Brignolel was 23 years old, a student of French ancestry whose family had come to Russia in an earlier generation, a detail that gave him a slightly exotic quality in the Sverdlovsk hiking community without otherwise distinguishing him from his peers. He was experienced and capable, one of the stronger hikers in the group. Lyudmila Dubinina was 20 years old, the youngest member of the group, a student of economics who had joined the hiking club at UPI and had accumulated considerable experience across her years as a member. She was described by those who knew her as determined and capable, someone who did not allow her youth or her gender to be used as reasons to doubt her capability in the mountains, and whose track record in previous expeditions demonstrated that the capability was real. Alexander Zolotaryov was 38 years old, the oldest member of the group by a significant margin, a veteran of the Second World War who had served in the Soviet military and whose subsequent career had taken directions that were not entirely clear even to his companions on the expedition. He was not a student at UPI and was not known to the others before he joined the group for this specific trip, having asked to be included when a spot became available. His background was more varied and more opaque than the others. He had worked in tourism and outdoor education and had extensive wilderness experience, but the details of his earlier career and the precise nature of his connections were subjects that he did not discuss with the younger members of the group in any detail. He was known as a skilled and experienced outdoorsman who was pleasant company and who pulled his weight on the expedition. And then there was Yuri Yudin, 21 years old, a student at UPI, a friend of Dyatlov and several of the others, someone who had been looking forward to this trip for months. Yudin left the expedition on the 28th of January, 3 days into the journey, turning back because of a pain in his leg that he identified as rheumatism, and that was, at the time, simply a disappointment, a frustrating physical failure at the beginning of what he had expected to be one of the great experiences of his hiking life. He said goodbye to his friends at the settlement of Second Northern, where the expedition had stopped to rest, and he turned back south towards Sverdlovsk. He was the only member of the Dyatlov group who came home. The expedition had set out from Sverdlovsk on the 23rd of January, 1959, traveling north by train to the town of Ivdel and then by truck to the remote settlement of Vishai, and from there, on foot and on skis, into the wilderness of the northern Urals. The route Dyatlov had planned was ambitious. An ascent of Otorten, a peak in the northern Urals whose name in the local Mansi language is sometimes translated as "Don't go there," across the high terrain of the Ural Ridge, with a return route that would bring them south again after approximately 3 weeks. The terrain was serious, but within the group's collective capability, and the planning had been thorough enough that the risk, while real, was the managed risk of experienced people operating in challenging conditions. In the days before Yudin turned back, the group had been making good progress and documenting it in the characteristic way of Soviet hiking expeditions of the period, with regular diary entries and with photographs taken on the equipment they carried, a camera that produced the last visual record of the 9 hikers as living people. The photographs from the first days of the expedition show a group of young people in the cold, laughing, working, skiing, setting up camp, the ordinary life of an expedition that is going well, the ordinary life that would shortly become extraordinary and then inexplicable and then final. After Yudin left on the 28th, the remaining 9 continued north and east, making their way toward the higher terrain of the Ural Ridge. The diary entries from this period, kept collectively by various members of the group and later recovered by the investigation, describe progress and conditions without remarkable incident. The weather had been manageable, the skiing conditions were adequate, the group's spirits appear to have been good. There is no indication in the documentary record from these days of any reason for alarm. On the 1st of February 1959, the group began their ascent of the slope of Kholat Syakhl, the mountain on whose eastern slope they would die. Kholat Syakhl means, in the Mansi language, something approximating dead mountain, a name that has acquired retrospective significance without the significance necessarily being intentional in the Mansi naming tradition, which applied descriptive or mythological names to landscape features without necessarily anticipating the specific events that would give those names their darkest resonance for later audiences. The slope they were ascending is not, by the standards of the northern Urals, a particularly dramatic or dangerous piece of terrain. It rises at an angle of approximately 20 to 30 degrees, a moderate grade that presents challenges for skiers with heavy packs, but that is not, under normal conditions, a site of technical mountaineering difficulty. The scale of the mountain is significant, and the exposure is real, the open treeless terrain of the upper slopes being subject to whatever wind and weather the northern Ural climate provides. But a group of the experience level of Dyatlov's team should have been well within their capability on this particular slope. In the late afternoon of the 1st of February, the group made a decision that has been analyzed and debated in the 65 years since the investigation discovered its consequence. They were slightly off course, displaced from their planned route to the east by the wind and the conditions, and the tree line below them, which would have provided both wind shelter and material for fire, was a moderate descent away. The standard practice for winter mountaineering expeditions in these conditions, and the practice that Dyatlov himself had followed on previous expeditions, was to descend to the tree line before making camp for the night. The tree line offered shelter, fuel, and the specific protection from wind that the open slope above it did not. Instead, the group made camp on the open slope. They pitched the tent on the exposed face of Kolatsiakl, below the summit and above the tree line, in a position that provided no shelter from wind and that required the creation of a platform in the snow to make the tent surface level enough to sleep on. The diary entry from that day, the last entry in the collective expedition diary, notes the conditions with the characteristic practicality of expedition records: the temperature, the progress of the day, the campsite choice, without explanation of why the tree line was not sought. The photographs taken on this final day show the group working on the tent, setting up camp, some of them smiling for the camera. These are the last photographs. Whatever happened after the tent was established and the group settled in for the night, no camera captured it. What happened was something that caused 9 experienced, capable, well-prepared people to cut their way out of a tent in the middle of a February night without their boots and to walk, in temperatures that kill unprotected people in minutes, away from their shelter and down the slope toward the tree line. They left their supplies, they left their food, they left their equipment. They walked out of everything that would have kept them alive in the environment they were in, and they did not come back. The rescue teams that found the tent found it abandoned in the specific, arresting way that abandoned things in wild places carry a specific quality of dread, the dread of the missing presence, the space where people were and are now not. The tent's contents were undisturbed. The equipment was there. The food was there. The diaries were there. The vodka they had brought for the celebration at the end of the route was there. Everything that 9 people had needed to survive was inside the tent. Everything they had needed to survive had been left behind. The search teams followed the footprints in the snow. The footprints led down the slope, toward the tree line, in a pattern consistent with a group of people walking, not running, in the darkness. The footprints were distinct enough, in the snow of the slope, to show the individual gaits of the walkers and to confirm that they were moving voluntarily, rather than being dragged or chased, moving in the specific way of people who are going somewhere, rather than people who are being driven. This is one of the details that has always complicated the simpler theories about what happened. The people who left that tent were walking, not running. They were moving together, or roughly together, in the same direction. They were not in the panicked, chaotic flight of people who are being pursued by something fast and dangerous. They were walking, in socked or bare feet, in -30 degrees, away from their shelter, and they did not stop and turn back. The first bodies were found near a large cedar tree at the edge of the tree line, approximately 1.5 kilometers from the tent. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were found there, at the base of the tree, wearing only their underwear. The cedar tree showed evidence of human activity. Branches had been broken off at heights of up to 5 meters, evidence of someone climbing the tree, perhaps to look back up the slope toward the tent, perhaps to see something above them in the darkness. The branches broken in the specific way that results from a human body making its way upward through a tree that does not want to be climbed. There was evidence of a small fire near the tree. The fire had gone out. The cold, in the end, had done what it always does in those temperatures to an unprotected person who has stopped generating enough movement to maintain their body heat. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko had died at the cedar tree, and they had died from hypothermia, their bodies stripped of the clothing that the first stages of paradoxical undressing produces, the phenomenon in which extreme hypothermia causes the blood vessels near the skin to paradoxically dilate in a way that produces a sensation of warmth, causing the dying person to remove their own clothing in the final stages. Between the cedar tree and the tent, the other bodies were found, 3 of them, each at a different distance from the tree, each in a posture consistent with someone who had been trying to make their way back up the slope toward the tent and had not reached it. Igor Dyatlov was found approximately 300 meters from the cedar tree, his body positioned as though he had fallen and not risen, lying in the snow at a slight elevation, with his arms raised, as though he had been trying to protect himself or to hold himself up. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found 630 meters from the cedar tree, closest to the tent of the 3, her body in the snow, her posture suggesting she had died while still trying to move. Between them, Rustem Slobodin was found, his body likewise in the posture of someone who had been moving and had stopped. All 3 had died of hypothermia. Slobodin had, in addition, a fracture in his skull, a crack approximately 1.5 centimeters long that the medical examiner noted, but that was determined to have been survivable, not sufficient on its own to cause death, but sufficient, combined with the hypothermia, to explain the specific point at which he could no longer continue. How the fracture had occurred was not established. It could have been a fall on the icy slope. It could have been something else. The 4 remaining hikers were not found in February. The spring and early summer search continued, while the snow of the northern Urals persisted on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, and in early May, when the snow had begun to melt and the terrain was more accessible, the remaining members of the group were found in a ravine, approximately 70 meters from the cedar tree, under approximately 4 meters of snow. The ravine, which had been filled in by avalanche debris or accumulated snowfall across the winter, had concealed them completely. Nicolas Thibault-Brignolel, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Solotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov. They were together in the ravine, and what the investigation found when their bodies were examined established the specific, strange, deeply troubling dimension of the Dyatlov Pass case that no subsequent theory has adequately explained. Nicolas Thibault-Brignolel had a massive fracture of the skull. The fracture was so significant, the damage to the bone so extensive, that the medical examiner described it as consistent with a tremendous blow to the head or with the kind of compressive force produced by a car accident. But there was no corresponding external wound. The skull was destroyed from within by a force that had produced no apparent injury to the skin covering it. There was no bruise, there was no cut, there was no mark on the outside of his head that corresponded to the catastrophic internal damage. Alexander Zolotaryov had multiple fractured ribs. The fractures were bilateral, affecting both sides of the chest, in a pattern that the medical examiner described as consistent with a compressive force of significant magnitude, the kind of force applied simultaneously to both sides of the body, the kind of force that is produced by a car crash or by being crushed between 2 surfaces. Like Thibault-Brignolel's skull, the rib fractures were internal damage without corresponding external marks. The skin over the broken ribs was intact. Lyudmila Dubinina had the most extensive injuries and the most disturbing missing elements. She had multiple fractured ribs, bilateral, like Zolotaryov, consistent with massive compressive force, consistent with the same event or mechanism that had damaged her companions. Her eyes were missing, her lips were missing, her tongue was missing. The official explanation for the absence of these specific features was decomposition and scavenging by animals during the months the bodies had lain in the ravine. The explanation has been accepted by some and contested by others. The tongue and lips of a body preserved in sub-zero temperatures under several meters of snow do not decompose in the usual way, and scavenger access to a body buried under 4 meters of snow is limited. Whatever happened to the missing features of Lyudmila Dubinina's face has not been definitively established. Alexander Kolevatov had no significant internal injuries. He was found alongside his companions in the ravine and had died, by the medical examiner's assessment, of hypothermia. The investigation that the Soviet government conducted into the deaths of the Dyatlov group was led by Lev Ivanov, a criminal investigator who worked the case with the resources and the access available to him under the specific conditions of the Soviet system in 1959, which meant a thorough investigation in some respects and a constrained one in others. Ivanov interviewed surviving witnesses. He examined the scene. He consulted medical experts and received their testimony about the injuries. He gathered all the available evidence, and he reached a conclusion that has been quoted in essentially every account of the case since its eventual partial disclosure. An unknown compelling force had caused the deaths of the Dyatlov group. This was not an admission of the paranormal. It was the specific language of a Soviet legal investigator who had examined the available evidence and concluded that no identified physical mechanism could be named as the cause. The case was closed without naming the force. The files were classified. The Northern Urals kept their secret. The radiation, this is the element of the investigation that was not initially part of the public record and that emerged when the files were eventually made available, in partial form, after the Soviet Union's collapse. The clothing of several members of the group was found to be contaminated with radioactive material. The levels were significant enough to be noted and recorded by the investigation, though the specific isotopes identified and the specific levels measured have been reported inconsistently across different sources that claim access to the files, making independent assessment of their significance difficult. The clothing of Krivonishenko and Dubinina and Zolotaryov showed elevated readings. The investigation did not publicly establish an explanation for the radioactivity. The orange-brown discoloration of the skin of the hikers was noted by the rescue teams and by the medical examiners. This discoloration has been attributed to various causes in the subsequent discussion of the case, to the normal post-mortem processes of skin that has been exposed to cold and to UV radiation, to hypothermia's effects on the peripheral circulation, and to radiation exposure. None of these explanations has been universally accepted, and the specific quality of the discoloration, as described by those who saw the bodies in person, is difficult to evaluate from documentary sources alone. The orange spheres. Multiple witnesses in the area of the Northern Urals around the time of the deaths, including hikers on other expeditions and soldiers at military installations, reported seeing glowing orange or fiery spheres in the sky above the Ural Mountains in the period from late January to early February 1959. These reports were independent of each other, came from people with no obvious reason to fabricate them, and described something that was not consistent with any conventional aircraft or with the Northern Lights. Spheres were seen to move and to hold position, to appear and disappear. Their nature was never officially explained. Their possible connection to the deaths of the Dyatlov group was noted by the investigation and not formally resolved. The 1959 investigation asked itself whether the Mansi, the indigenous people of the northern Ural region, were in any way responsible for the deaths. The Mansi had cultural and spiritual relationships to the landscape of the region, including to Kholat, and the initial speculation about the deaths included the possibility of a conflict between the hikers and members of the local population. The investigation interviewed Mansi people and examined the question thoroughly, and concluded that there was no evidence of Mansi involvement, that the relationships between the local indigenous population and Soviet hikers in the region were not characterized by the kind of conflict that would generate violence, and that the specific nature of the deaths was inconsistent with the kind of violence that human attackers would have produced. The Mansi theory was dismissed, and its dismissal is one of the few elements of the investigation that has not been seriously challenged in the subsequent decades. The avalanche theory is the most conventional of the serious explanations for the Dyatlov Pass deaths, and it is the explanation that the Russian government officially endorsed in its 2019 reinvestigation of the case, which represented the most substantial official revisiting of the evidence in the 60 years since the original investigation. The basic version of the avalanche theory proposes that the group was disturbed in the night by an avalanche that struck or threatened their tent, causing them to cut their way out and flee down the slope. The problems with the basic avalanche theory are multiple and well documented. There is no evidence in the photographs or in the reports from the scene of any avalanche deposit. The slope angle of the camping location is below the minimum typically required to generate avalanches, and the footprints leading away from the tent showed no sign of disturbance that a large mass of moving snow would have produced. The slab avalanche variant, which the 2019 investigation endorsed, proposes a specific mechanism in which a slab of denser snow, formed by wind compaction on the slope above the tent, detached and slid onto the tent without leaving the debris field of a large conventional avalanche. The 2019 investigation used computer modeling to demonstrate that such a slab could have produced the compressive injuries seen in the 4 hikers found in the ravine, specifically the bilateral rib fractures and the skull fracture of Thibaut Brignolel, through the weight and pressure of the sliding snow acting on bodies inside the tent. The 2019 investigation concluded that this slab avalanche, triggered either naturally or by the disturbance of cutting through the snow platform they had created for the tent, was the most likely explanation for the events of February 1 to 2. The 2019 conclusion has not ended the debate. The researchers and advocates associated with the Dyatlov Foundation, which was established specifically to continue the investigation of the case, have contested the slab avalanche conclusion on multiple grounds. They note that the slab avalanche scenario, even in its most developed form, does not explain the radioactivity found on the clothing of several hikers. It does not explain the orange spheres seen in the area. It does not explain the specific missing features of Lyudmila Dubinina's face. It does not explain why the group, after leaving the tent, did not try to re-enter it or to shelter behind it, but instead walked 1.5 kilometers to the tree line. In a slab avalanche scenario, the tent would have been partially buried, but the group could still have returned to it or sheltered near it. They did not. The infrasound theory, developed by a number of researchers across the decades, proposes that the specific topography of the Ural Mountains in the vicinity of Kholat is capable of generating infrasound, acoustic frequencies below the range of human hearing, under certain wind conditions. Infrasound at specific frequencies has been shown in laboratory conditions to produce physiological effects in human subjects that include disorientation, panic, a sense of dread, visual disturbances, and, at higher intensities, physical discomfort. The theory proposes that the group experienced a period of infrasound-induced panic that drove them from the tent in a state of terror that overrode their rational understanding of the lethal consequences of exposure without proper clothing. The infrasound theory has an appealing quality as an explanation. It would explain the apparently voluntary departure from the tent, the fact that the group was walking rather than running, and the absence of any external threat that the investigation could identify. But it faces problems that have prevented its acceptance as the definitive explanation. The most significant is the question of why infrasound, if it was present and if it was responsible for driving the group from the tent, did not also drive them back to the tent or to some shelter when the effect presumably diminished as they moved down the slope. The group apparently stayed in the area of the tree line, made a fire, and some of them attempted to return to the tent, which implies a degree of rational behavior after the departure that is inconsistent with the sustained panic that the infrasound theory would require. The Soviet military activity theory is the one that the classified nature of the original investigation and the specific details of certain witnesses' backgrounds make most difficult to dismiss and most difficult to confirm. The northern Urals in North Hans 59 were a region of significant Soviet military activity, including the testing of rockets and missile systems at ranges in the vicinity of the Ural Mountain region. The orange spheres reported by multiple independent witnesses are consistent in some descriptions with the appearance of rocket tests or missile launches seen from a distance. The radioactivity found on the clothing of certain group members has been proposed as evidence of exposure to fallout from a military test or to contact with radioactive debris. The specific detail of Yuri Krivonishenko's employment at Chelyabinsk 40, the closed nuclear facility, Alexander Kolevatov's previous work at a classified research institute in Moscow, have been proposed by some researchers as relevant. The theory that the Dyatlov group was in a restricted military area, either knowingly or unknowingly, and that the Soviet military or security services were in some way involved in or responsible for their deaths. The classification of the case files for 30 years after the original investigation and the continued classification of certain portions of the files after the partial opening that followed the Soviet Union's collapse is cited as evidence consistent with the military activity theory. The specific problems with the military activity theory are also significant. The compressive injuries produced in 3 of the hikers found in the ravine are not obviously consistent with any known weapon of the period, and the proposed mechanism by which a military test or activity could have produced internal injuries without external marks has not been clearly established. The theory requires a level of Soviet military and security service intervention in a domestic civilian matter that would have been unusual even by the standards of the late Stalin period, and the deaths in 1959 post-date the worst excesses of Stalinist terror. The KGB theory, related to the military activity theory but distinct from it, proposes that the Dyatlov group encountered something they were not supposed to encounter, perhaps a military installation or a secret project, and that Soviet security services were directly responsible for their deaths. The theory typically invokes Zolotaryov's background as the most suspicious element: his age, his military service, his opaque subsequent career, and his joining the group at the last minute for a trip he had no previous connection to, have been proposed as evidence that he was either an informant or an operative who was surveilling the other members of the group for the KGB or some other Soviet security organization. The problems with the KGB theory are the problems of all conspiracy theories that require broad involvement without leaving traces, the number of people who would have had to have been involved, and the complete absence of any corroborating evidence from the decades of Soviet archives that have been opened since the Union's collapse, make a deliberately organized killing of this kind difficult to sustain as an explanation. The atmospheric or natural phenomenon theories, including ball lightning and various proposed forms of unusual electrical or meteorological events, occupy a category between the conventional explanations and the explicitly paranormal theories. Ball lightning is a documented but poorly understood phenomenon, observed by credible witnesses across many countries and contexts, that produces effects consistent with some of the observations from the Dyatlov case, including glowing spheres, radiated energy, and burns. The orange spheres seen in the area have been interpreted by some researchers as ball lightning rather than as military rockets, and the specific injuries to the hikers have been proposed as consistent with exposure to intense electromagnetic radiation from a large-scale atmospheric electrical discharge. These theories are not outside the bounds of physical possibility, but they rely on natural phenomena that are not well enough understood to allow the specific claims made about them in the context of the Dyatlov case to be rigorously tested. The most that can be said is that the atmospheric phenomenon theories are not ruled out by the evidence, which is a different thing from being supported by it. The Yeti theory and the various explicitly paranormal theories persist in the popular discussion of the case, with a persistence that reflects both the specific inexplicability of certain elements of the evidence and the general human tendency to reach for extraordinary explanations when ordinary explanations have failed. The Soviet investigators who first worked the case reportedly noted in unofficial communications that the nature of the injuries was consistent with what might be expected from an encounter with an immensely powerful creature, though this observation was made in a context that was explicitly speculative and explicitly unofficial. The injuries to Thibaut Brignolel and to the two hikers with bilateral rib fractures, if they resulted from an external physical force applied to the body, would require a force of extraordinary magnitude, and the imagination, searching for what could produce such a force in that environment, has occasionally arrived at the conclusion of a creature of supernatural strength. The investigators and serious researchers who have examined the case most carefully do not accept the paranormal theories, and the absence of any physical evidence of a large creature at the scene, the absence of tracks, the absence of any marks on the external skin of the injured hikers that would correspond to a physical assault by something with limbs or claws, makes the creature theory very difficult to sustain against the available evidence. The paradox of the Dyatlov Pass case, the thing that makes it genuinely and persistently mysterious rather than simply complicated, is the way in which each proposed explanation resolves some elements of the evidence while failing to explain others. The avalanche explains the compressive injuries, but not the radioactivity, not the missing tongue and eyes, not the orange spheres, not the flight from the tent in socked feet. The military activity explains the radioactivity and possibly the compressive injuries, but not the specific manner of the flight from the tent or the deaths of the first 5 in the open. The infrasound explains the flight from the tent, but not the injuries to the 4 in the ravine. No single theory, applied to the full body of evidence, accounts for everything the investigation found. The Dyatlov Foundation, established by surviving friends of the victims and their families, has continued to advocate for a genuine resolution of the case. The members of the foundation have examined the available files, have conducted their own investigations, have commissioned their own forensic analyses of the evidence, and have consistently argued that the 2019 official conclusion of a slab avalanche was inadequate to the full evidentiary record. They have pointed specifically to the radioactivity, to the questions about Lyudmila Dubinina's missing features, to the orange spheres, and to the portions of the original investigation files that remain classified and have not been released, as evidence that the full truth of what happened has not been established. The files. The original investigation files were classified for approximately 30 years after the investigation was concluded, reopened partially after the Soviet Union's collapse, and partly reclassified after the 2019 investigation. The material in those files, whatever it contains, has not been fully made available to independent researchers. The portions that remain classified may contain nothing of significance, redacted for administrative rather than substantive reasons. They may contain evidence that has not been made public because of its sensitivity. The specific contents of what remains classified are unknown to anyone outside the relevant Russian state agencies. Yuri Yudin was 21 years old when he turned back from the expedition on the 28th of January, 1959, and said goodbye to his 9 friends at the settlement of Second Northern. He spent the rest of his life with that farewell. He was the person who identified the equipment and the clothing of his friends when the investigation gathered what had been found on the slope and in the ravine. The only person who had been close enough to them to know which sleeping bag was whose, which jacket belonged to which person, what specific personal items belonged to each of the 9. The identification was a process that took him, by his own accounts, through a grief that was complicated by the specific knowledge that he should have been there, that he had been part of the group, that the illness that had turned him back was the specific accident of biology that had placed him on the south side of the mountain while his friends froze on the north. He spent the decades after 1959 returning to the question of what had happened. He spoke to investigators and journalists and researchers. He participated in commemorations and anniversaries. He visited the mountain. He examined the evidence, and he listened to the theories, and he did not, in the 54 years of his life after the expedition, arrive at an explanation that satisfied him. He said, in the last years of his life, that he needed to understand, that the need to understand was the thing that had shaped the most significant years of his adult life, and that the failure to understand was itself a kind of grief that did not resolve with the passage of time, but persisted in the specific form of an open wound that the evidence had never closed. Yuri Yudin died on the 27th of April, 2013, at the age of 75. He did not know what had happened to his friends. The investigation had not given him an answer that he could accept, and the 50 years of public discussion of the case had not produced one either. He died, as the 9 died, without a resolution. The Ural Mountains are still there. Kholat Shakhl is still there, under its Russian name and its Mansi name, rising from the Ural Plateau in the specific way of northern Ural peaks, not dramatic but comprehensive, not spectacular but thorough, the kind of mountain that is defined not by any single dramatic feature, but by its sheer completeness as an environment, by the total quality of its isolation and its cold and its indifference to the people who climb it. The pass that was named after Igor Dyatlov is still there, known now as Dyatlov Pass, a recognition that he exists in the geography of the place as his friends exist in it, permanent in the way that only landscape is permanent in the specific way that the mountain remembers nothing and records everything. The tent site on the eastern slope is visited every year by people who want to stand where the tent was, who want to see the view that the 9 saw, who want to place themselves in the geography of the mystery and feel whatever it is that standing in that place produces. The mountain provides the view and the cold and the wind. It does not provide the answer. 9 people, February of 1959, an unknown compelling force. 65 years of investigation, no definitive explanation. The files, in part, still classified. The question, still open, the cold, in February, the same as it has always been. Whatever happened in that tent, in that cold, on that night, the mountain has not said. The files that remain classified have not said. The evidence, gathered and examined and re-examined across 6 decades, has not produced the single coherent account that would allow the case to be closed with the certainty that 9 lives deserve. They went to the mountain with plans and equipment and the specific confident capability of experienced people who knew what they were doing. What they encountered there is not known. What drove them from their shelter in the dark is not known. What produced the injuries that some of them carried and that none of them survived is not known. The mountain is named Dead Mountain. The pass is named Dyatlov Pass. The 9 are not forgotten. The answer has not been found. In the northern Urals, in February, the stars are very bright and very close, and the cold is total and thorough, and the silence, in the absence of wind, is the silence of a place that keeps what it knows to itself. The specific texture of the investigation that followed the discovery of the tent and the bodies deserves more sustained attention than summary accounts of the case typically provide, because the investigation was itself a complex and layered process that reflected both the genuine professional commitment of the people conducting it and the specific constraints of the Soviet system in which it was conducted, and both of those things matter for understanding what the investigation did and did not produce. Lev Ivanov, the investigator who led the formal inquiry, was by all accounts a competent and conscientious professional who approached the case with the seriousness it warranted. He interviewed witnesses, gathered physical evidence, commissioned forensic examinations, and attempted to build from the available facts a coherent account of what had happened. He was not, by the evidence of his conduct and his later public statements about the case, someone who was trying to suppress the truth, but someone who was genuinely unable to establish it from the evidence available to him. The constraints he operated under were real. The investigation was conducted under Soviet conditions, which meant that certain lines of inquiry were either not available to him or were actively discouraged. The military dimension of the question, specifically the relationship between the deaths and any ongoing Soviet military activity in the region, was a dimension that a civilian criminal investigator in 1959 was not positioned to pursue against the resistance of military institutions that had no obligation to cooperate with him. The specific protocols of Soviet state secrecy meant that certain categories of information that might have been relevant were simply not accessible to the investigation. Ivanov later said, in interviews given after the Soviet period ended and some of the case materials became available, that he had believed at the time of the investigation that the deaths were connected to some kind of military or state activity that he had been prevented from examining fully, that the classification of the files was not merely administrative, but was the concealment of something substantive, and that he had written his final report in the specific language of unknown compelling force, not as an honest assessment of total ignorance, but as the only language available to him in the circumstances. These statements, made late in his life, are suggestive, but cannot themselves be treated as definitive evidence. A retired investigator, reflecting on a case from 30 years prior, has his own perspectives and his own investments in how the case is understood. The forensic evidence in the case is the foundation on which all the theories ultimately rest, and the forensic evidence has the specific limitation of having been gathered and analyzed under the conditions of Soviet medicine and Soviet forensic pathology in 1959, conditions that were not inferior to contemporary Western forensic science, but that did not have access to many of the analytical tools that subsequent decades have developed. The observations made by the medical examiners who examined the bodies, the injuries they noted, the conclusions they reached about cause and mechanism of death, were made by professionals working with the tools they had, and those observations are the primary material from which subsequent researchers have worked. The question of the compressive injuries, the bilateral rib fractures of Dubinina and Zolotaryov, and the skull fracture of Thibault-Brignolel, combined with the absence of any corresponding external marks on the skin, has been the most debated single element of the forensic evidence. The medical examiner's description of these injuries as consistent with a car crash has been the most frequently quoted of all the forensic observations in the case, and it has been used to support everything from the slab avalanche theory to the military weapon theory to the theories that involve a large physical creature. The 2019 investigation used computerized biomechanical modeling to assess whether the pressure of a slab of snow sliding across a tent containing human bodies could produce the specific pattern of injuries documented in the 3 most severely injured hikers. The modeling produced results consistent with such a mechanism. The specific bilateral nature of the rib fractures and the pattern of the skull fracture were shown to be producible by the compression of a snow slab acting on a body inside a tent. This modeling is the strongest scientific support the slab avalanche theory has received, and it addresses the most frequently cited objection to the avalanche explanation. The critics of the 2019 conclusion have not conceded on the modeling results, arguing that the modeling was constrained by assumptions that may not have been accurate to the specific conditions of the tent on the night in question, and that the full evidentiary picture cannot be addressed by biomechanical modeling of the injury mechanism alone. They continue to press the radioactivity, the missing features of Dubinina, their orange spheres, and the classified files as elements of the case that the 2019 investigation did not adequately address. The radioactivity question is one on which the available documentation is frustratingly incomplete. The specific isotopes detected on the clothing, the specific levels measured, and the specific conclusions drawn by the investigators who conducted the radiological analysis in 1959 have not been consistently reported across the various sources that claim to have had access to the investigation files. Some accounts cite beta particle emitters, which would be consistent with certain kinds of radioactive contamination from nuclear facilities or from testing fallout. Other accounts suggest different isotopes or different levels. The specific scientific content of the radiological analysis has not been published in a form that would allow independent evaluation, and the documents that contain it are among those that have not been fully released. Krivonishenko's employment at Chelyabinsk 40, the closed nuclear facility in the southern Urals that processed plutonium for Soviet nuclear weapons, is a documented fact. The facility was the site of the Kishtim disaster, a nuclear accident that occurred in September 1957, approximately 2 years before the Dyatlov expedition, and that released significant quantities of radioactive contamination across a wide area of the Ural region. Whether Krivonishenko's prior employment at the facility could explain residual contamination on his clothing 2 years after his employment there ended is a question that requires specific knowledge of the levels of contamination at the facility, the specific protective protocols in use, and the half-lives of the relevant isotopes, knowledge that the available public record of the case does not provide sufficient basis to evaluate. The Kishtim disaster itself, which was classified by the Soviet government for decades and was not publicly acknowledged until after the Soviet Union's collapse, is relevant to the Dyatlov case in a more general way. It demonstrates that the Soviet state was capable of concealing significant radiological events from the public and from its own citizens for extended periods, and that the infrastructure for doing so was in place and was used actively in the relevant period. This context does not prove that the Dyatlov case involved concealed radiological activity, but it makes the concealment scenario less categorically implausible than it might otherwise appear. The specific geography of the night of February 1st to 2nd is worth examining in more detail than the narrative of the case typically provides, because the geography of who was found where and in what condition carries information about the sequence of events that the investigation tried, and to some degree failed to decode. The cedar tree, approximately 1.5 kilometers from the tent at the edge of the tree line, was clearly a gathering point. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko were found there, and the evidence of fire and of climbing the tree suggests that it was a location where some of the group spent significant time after leaving the tent. The climbing of the tree is itself a puzzling detail. In extreme cold and in states of incipient hypothermia, climbing a tree is not a behavior that has an obvious explanation. It requires effort, and it serves no obvious survival purpose if the goal is to reach the tree line and find shelter and fuel for a fire. The investigators' interpretation that someone was trying to see something, perhaps to look back at the tent, or to see something above them on the slope, is plausible, but not the only interpretation. The fire at the cedar tree burned out, or was extinguished, and the two men there died of hypothermia. They had, in the final stages, apparently removed clothing, the paradoxical undressing of terminal hypothermia producing the stripped condition in which they were found. Some of the clothing that was removed from Doroshenko and Krivonishenko was later found on Dubinina and others, suggesting that after the two men died, the survivors took clothing from them to try to maintain their own body temperatures. This detail is one of the more human and more tragic of the case. The survivors, in their desperation, stripped the clothing from their dead companions in an attempt to stay alive long enough to reach the tent or to find some other form of shelter. 3 of the survivors appear to have tried to return to the tent. Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova were found between the cedar tree and the tent, progressively closer to the tent in the order they were found as the search moved up the slope from the cedar. The interpretation that they were trying to reach the tent is consistent with their positions, and the finding of Kolmogorova closest to the tent, 630 meters from the cedar, suggests that she had made the most progress before she fell. Whether she fell from hypothermia or from some other cause, whether she had been in communication with the others or was making her own attempt, is not established. The 4 in the ravine are the most mysterious in their final position. The ravine is off to the side of the direct line between the cedar tree and the tent, and the 4 hikers found there are the ones with the most severe injuries. Whether the 4 were separated from the others before or after the departure from the tent, whether the injuries they carried were sustained at the tent or were sustained in some encounter in the area of the ravine, and why they ended up in the ravine rather than at the cedar tree or on the path toward the tent, are questions that the investigation did not fully resolve. The construction of a snow den of some kind in the ravine area has been proposed in some accounts, that the 4 were attempting to build an emergency shelter, that the ravine was deliberately chosen as a location where they might find some protection from the wind, while constructing something that would protect them through the rest of the night. Whether this is what happened, or whether their presence in the ravine reflects something else, perhaps an attempt to avoid something on the slope above them, perhaps the chance geography of people moving in the dark in the cold, is not established. The specific question of what could produce bilateral rib fractures and massive skull fracture without external marks in a human body in the context of the Dyatlov Pass scenario has been explored by various researchers using various methodologies. The compression hypothesis, which the 2019 investigation supported through modeling, requires a force that acts simultaneously on both sides of the body without concentrating at any specific point, in a way that would mark the skin. Snow, under certain conditions, can act in this way. A snow slab of sufficient mass and moving at sufficient speed over a body can distribute its force over a large area in a way that produces compressive internal injuries without the concentrated impact injuries that a more direct force would produce. But the force required, even from a snow slab, to produce the degree of internal damage documented in the most severely injured hikers, has been calculated by some researchers as extremely large, requiring a slab of significant weight and speed. Whether the gentle slope of Kolat in the area of the tent could generate a slab of sufficient size and speed to produce the documented injuries has been contested, with engineers and geologists arguing on both sides of the question. The terrain conditions on the night of February 1st, including any wind and temperature changes that might have altered the snowpack, are not known. The decades since the partial opening of the case files have seen the Dyatlov Pass incident become one of the most researched and most discussed unsolved mysteries in modern history, attracting the sustained attention of professional researchers, amateur investigators, documentary filmmakers, novelists, and the general public of multiple countries. The case has its own foundation, dedicated researchers, a substantial bibliography in Russian and increasingly in English and other languages, multiple documentary films, and a specific community of people who have spent years or decades engaged with the evidence. This sustained attention has produced a considerable body of secondary research and analysis that the original 1959 investigation did not have access to, including modern snow mechanics research that bears on the slab avalanche question, modern forensic pathology perspectives on the injury patterns, modern radiological analysis applied to the documented contamination findings, and modern geophysical research on the infrasound question. None of this secondary research has produced the single definitive explanation that would end the debate. The Russian researcher Eugenia Zinovieva has argued, on the basis of detailed analysis of the footprint pattern leaving the tent, that the 9 departed the tent in 2 groups rather than as a single group, with one group ahead and one following. If this reading of the footprint evidence is correct, it would suggest that the 2 groups may have had different information about what they were fleeing or moving toward, that the group was not unified in its understanding of what was happening on the slope. The footprint analysis has been contested by other researchers, and the quality of the footprint evidence, after the passage of time and the disturbance of the search, makes definitive conclusions from it difficult. The last photographs taken by the group's camera are among the most discussed pieces of evidence in the case. Several of the photographs from the final day, February 1st, show the group working on the tent, in conditions of poor visibility and strong wind. One photograph, taken in the failing light of the afternoon, shows something in the sky above the slope that some researchers have interpreted as a sphere or a disk of light, and others have interpreted as a photographic artifact or as the sun in unusual atmospheric conditions. The photograph is unclear enough that neither interpretation can be confirmed from the image alone. The question of what the 9 experienced in the final hours before their deaths is the question that makes the Dyatlov Pass case not merely a mystery, but a specific kind of haunting. It is the question of what it was like to be there, what they saw and felt and understood in those minutes when they cut the tent and walked into the cold. Whatever drove them out of the tent with such urgency that they did not stop to put on their boots was experienced by 9 people who knew the mountains, who knew what the cold was capable of, who understood the consequences of exposure without proper clothing. They chose exposure over whatever was in or around the tent. That choice, made by 9 experienced people simultaneously, in the middle of a February night in the northern Urals, is the heart of the mystery. Yuri Yudin identified their belongings. He identified the sleeping bag that belonged to Doroshenko, the jacket that belonged to Krivonishenko, the personal items that belonged to each of his friends. The identification was a process of grief and a process of confirmation, the forensic work of establishing who was where, done by the person who had been closest to them and who was now the only one of their group left to do it. He visited the mountain. He visited the pass that bore Dyatlov's name. He participated in the anniversaries. He gave interviews and spoke to researchers and answered the questions that people brought to him about the nine, about what they were like, about what he remembered, about what he thought had happened. He had been 2 weeks south of the mountain when it happened, in Sverdlovsk, in the warmth, returning to his ordinary student life in the specific ignorance of someone who does not yet know that the world has changed, that the friends who waved goodbye to him at Second Northern had died in the cold while he was traveling home by train. He knew, for the rest of his life, that he had been supposed to be there. Whether the knowledge was a source of survivor's guilt in the specific clinical sense, or whether it was something more diffuse and more personal, a sustained awareness of the contingency that had placed him on the right side of a departure point, while his friends remained on the wrong side, is not something that the public record discloses precisely. He spoke about it in terms that suggest the knowledge was always present, and that it shaped how he engaged with the investigation and with the question of what had happened. He died on the 27th of April 2013. He was 75 years old. He had been 21 when he turned back from the expedition in January of 1959, and he had spent more than 50 years with the question of what the mountain had done to his friends, and the mountain had not answered. The files that were reclassified after the 2019 investigation contain material that has not been made public. The Russian state agencies that hold those files have not disclosed what is in them or why it remains classified. A case from 1959, a case in which all parties are dead and the Soviet Union itself has ceased to exist, is being kept partially secret by the state that succeeded the Soviet Union, and the reasons for that continued secrecy have not been explained. The northern Urals in February are the same as they have always been. The cold is the same, the isolation is the same, the specific quality of the landscape, the treeless plateau of the upper slopes, the cedar forest of the tree line, the open sky above, is unchanged from what the nine saw when they pitched their tent on the 1st of February in 1959. The mountain is indifferent in the way that mountains are indifferent, not hostile, but not accommodating, offering the same conditions to everyone who comes to it, regardless of what they are there for or what they bring with them. The nine brought experience and preparation, and the specific confidence of people who had done this before and who trusted themselves in this environment. Whatever happened to that confidence and that capability in the night of February 1st to 2nd, it happened in the dark, in the cold, far from any other human being, and the nine people who experienced it are not here to report it. The only person who might have been there and might have understood what the others experienced enough to say something about it, turned back sick on the 28th of January and never knew what he had escaped, if escape is the right word for what the illness that made him turn back accomplished. Yuri Yudin escaped, or was spared, or was simply turned back by a pain in his leg that resolved itself once he was moving south, and the question of what he would have experienced if he had continued north with his friends is the question that he himself spent 50 years asking, from the outside, from the position of the person who did not know, because he was not there. The case is unsolved. The explanation is not known. The files are partly classified. The nine are buried in Ekaterinburg, in the city that was Sverdlovsk when they lived in it, in the same city where they went to university and joined the hiking club and planned the expedition and departed from, with the specific hopeful energy of people who are about to do something they have been looking forward to. Their graves are tended. The anniversary is commemorated. The foundation continues. The debate continues. The mountain continues. And whatever happened in that tent, whatever the unknown compelling force was that drove 9 experienced hikers into the cold in socked feet in the middle of a February night, it has not been named. It remains as the original investigator left it 65 years ago, unknown and compelling, the specific and sustained mystery of a mountain that has not explained itself, and a case that has not been closed. The cultural afterlife of the Dyatlov Pass incident is itself a significant phenomenon, the specific way in which a real event becomes, over time, a carrier of meaning that extends beyond the facts of what happened. 9 hikers who died on Kholat Syakhl in 1959 were not famous when they were alive. They were students and young professionals in a mid-sized Soviet city, people who loved the outdoors and who were very good at it, people whose names were known to the hiking club of their university and to the friends and families who knew them personally. The expedition they were on was ambitious, but not unprecedented, and was not intended to be a historic undertaking. It was a Category 3 winter hike in the northern Urals, a serious undertaking for serious hikers, not a landmark achievement in the history of exploration. What made their deaths remarkable was not the deaths themselves, but the manner of them, the specific combination of inexplicable behavior and inexplicable injuries, and the sustained refusal of any single explanation to account for all the evidence. This combination, and the decades of investigation that it generated, transformed the 9 hikers from people into characters in a mystery, and the mystery into one of the most widely discussed unexplained events of the 20th century, known across the world in a way that the 9 people at its center could not have anticipated. The Dyatlov Pass incident entered Western popular consciousness relatively slowly, constrained initially by the Soviet classification of the files and by the general inaccessibility of Soviet-era archival material, and then accelerating in the years after the Soviet Union's collapse, as the case files became partially available and as researchers in Russia and elsewhere began publishing accounts of the case that were accessible to. The Internet era accelerated this process further, creating communities of researchers who could share findings and challenge interpretations in real time, producing both more rigorous analysis and more speculative theorizing than any previous period of the case's public life. The effect of this international interest on the families of the 9 hikers has not always been uncomplicated. The transformation of their loved ones into subjects of a global mystery, into figures in a story that millions of people engage with, as entertainment or as intellectual puzzle, is a transformation that families of those involved in famous unsolved cases typically experience as both meaningful and complicated. It also reduces the people to their deaths and to the specific circumstances of their deaths, to the roles they play in the mystery rather than to the full people they were. The hiking club of the Ural Polytechnic Institute produced, in the period after the deaths, a tradition of commemorating the 9 that has persisted and evolved across the decades since. Annual expeditions to the pass, memorial services, the maintenance of the graves, these are the acts of a community that has not forgotten the 9 people and that has chosen to keep their memory in the specific register of people who were real, who had lives before they had deaths, rather than in the register of the case file entries that is the most common form in which they appear in the global discussion of the incident. The specific details of who the 9 were before the expedition, the particular qualities that made each of them distinct as a person, are worth dwelling on precisely because the mystery has a tendency to subsume the people into their roles in the narrative of the last night. The photographs from the early days of the expedition, before whatever happened, show people in motion, laughing, working, doing the specific practical things of a winter expedition with the specific energy of people who are doing something they genuinely enjoy. These photographs are the human record of the 9 as they actually were, and they matter more than the forensic photographs from the investigation, because they show something the forensic record cannot show: alive people in a landscape they had chosen, doing something they had worked hard to be good at. Lyudmila Dubinina was the youngest of the 9, 20 years old at the time of the expedition, and she had joined the hiking club at UPI with the specific determination of someone who has found something they want to be part of and who is willing to do the work to belong. Her presence on a Category 3 expedition reflects the assessment of experienced hikers who had watched her in previous expeditions and concluded that her capability warranted the invitation. She was studying economics, which places her in a professional context very different from the outdoors environment where she chose to spend her leisure time, a detail that says something about the range of her interests and the breadth of her life beyond the specific expedition that ended it. Alexander Zolotaryov remains the most mysterious of the 9 in terms of his personal biography. His age, 38 in a group whose next oldest member was 24, is one of the immediately noticeable things about the composition of the group. His relative unfamiliarity to the others, having joined the group specifically for this expedition without having been part of the UPI hiking club, is another. His military background and his somewhat varied subsequent career, which the investigation noted and did not fully account for, have generated the most speculation about his role in and relationship to whatever happened on the mountain. But the mystery of Zolotaryov is in part the mystery that any person becomes when the people who knew them best are gone and the records are incomplete and the institutional contexts in which they existed were themselves secret. He was a real person with a real history that the investigation touched on without fully documenting, and the gap between what is known about him and what is suggested by the known elements has been filled by researchers of varying credibility, with everything from the simply interesting to the frankly paranoid. The most likely reality of who Alexander Zolotaryov was is considerably more ordinary than the theories that have accreted around him, though the specific ordinariness of his biography may never be fully reconstructed from the available evidence. The specific decision to camp on the open slope rather than descending to the tree line on the afternoon of February 1st is the decision that every analysis of the case returns to, because it is the decision that placed the 9 in the specific exposed position from which the subsequent events proceeded. Dyatlov was an experienced expedition leader who had made this kind of decision before, who understood the calculus of risk in winter mountain camping, and who chose the open slope for reasons that the evidence does not disclose. The most commonly proposed explanations are that the weather conditions made the descent to the tree line more dangerous than the open slope, or that the group simply ran out of daylight and made the pragmatic decision to camp where they were, rather than descend in deteriorating visibility, or that Dyatlov was making a deliberate choice to camp at altitude for the experience of it and to practice high-altitude camping skills. None of these explanations is implausible, and any of them could be correct. The point is that the decision was, at the time it was made, within the range of reasonable expedition decisions, and that whatever made it catastrophic in retrospect was not apparent from the available information when the choice was made. Experienced people make reasonable decisions in uncertain conditions, and those decisions sometimes end in disaster, and the readiness to retroactively characterize such decisions as obvious mistakes is not honest about the conditions under which real decisions are made. The last diary entry in the collective expedition diary notes the day's progress with the specific matter-of-fact quality of expedition diaries, which are not literary productions, but functional records. It does not indicate alarm. It does not indicate unusual conditions. It is the journal of a group that has had a normal day of expedition activity and is preparing for a normal night. Whatever changed between the writing of that entry and the cutting of the tent did not announce itself in the record that the 9 left behind. The photographs from the final day include images taken in conditions of poor visibility, images in which the wind and the light and the specific quality of a winter afternoon in the northern Urals is visible in the photographs as atmosphere, as context, as the environment in which the expedition was operating. The faces in these photographs are recognizable as the faces of people who have been working hard in cold conditions, who are tired but not alarmed, who are getting camp set up with the pragmatic efficiency of experienced people who have done this many times. There is nothing in these photographs that says last, that says after this there is nothing, that says these are the final images of 9 people who are about to encounter something they will not survive. That is the specific weight of the last photographs of people who die unexpectedly. They carry the knowledge that the people looking at them have, that the people in them did not have, the knowledge of what came next, the knowledge that there is no next. The photographs from February 1st are the most looked at photographs in the entire Dyatlov case, not because they show anything remarkable, but because they show the 9 people while they were still 9 people and not yet 9 deaths, and the knowledge of what would follow gives them the specific weight of all last images of people who did not know they were taking last images. The cedar tree is still there. Trees in the northern Ural taiga are not fast growing, and a cedar of the size and age that the rescue teams found in February of 1959, one with branches high enough to climb to 5 meters, is a tree that was already old in 1959 and that has persisted in the decades since. People who visit the pass visit the cedar tree. They stand at its base and look up at the branches that were broken 65 years ago by people trying to see something in the dark, and they try to reconstruct what it would have felt like to be there, in that cold, having walked in socked feet from a tent 1.5 kilometers away, building a fire at the base of a tree, while something unknown pressed down on the night around them. The reconstruction fails, as all reconstructions of the irretrievable past fail, but it fails in the specific way of failures that still produce understanding, that bring you closer to the reality, even if they cannot bring you there. Standing at the cedar tree in February, in the cold of the northern Urals, is not the same as being there in 1959, in whatever conditions the 9 experienced. But it is not nothing. It is a way of placing yourself in the geography of the mystery, of feeling the scale of the landscape, and the quality of the cold, and the specific isolation of the place, and that feeling is a kind of knowledge, even if it is not the answer. The rescue team that found the tent had not come looking for a mystery. They had come looking for stranded hikers, hoping to find people who were cold and hungry, and who needed help getting down from the mountain. What they found instead was the beginning of 65 years of questions. They followed the footprints down the slope and found what the footprints led to, and what they found has not been fully explained to this day. The case is officially unsolved. The 2019 investigation produced a conclusion that many researchers do not accept. The files that remain classified have not been released. The 9 are in their graves in Ekaterinburg, together, in a section of the Mikhailovskoye cemetery that has become a site of pilgrimage for people who follow the case and who want to pay their respects to the people at the center of it. Their names are on the headstones: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonishenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Nicolas Thibault Brignolel, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Zolotaryov. 9 names. 9 lives that ended in the northern Urals in February of 1959, in circumstances that have not been explained to the satisfaction of anyone who has examined the full evidentiary record with intellectual honesty. The Ural Mountains keep their winter cold. The stars above the peaks in February are still very bright and very close. The cedar tree at the edge of the tree line on the eastern slope of Kholatsyakhl still stands. The pass still bears the name of the person who led the group that died there. And the unknown compelling force, as Lev Ivanov called it 65 years ago, has not been named. The mountain has not said what it knows. The classified files have not been released. The question has not been answered. 9 people went to the mountain. The mountain kept them. The world has been asking why ever since. The question of what the mountain knows, if we allow ourselves the literary extension of treating Kholatsyakhl as a thing that could know, is ultimately the question of what happened in the physical world on the night of February 1st to 2nd in 1959, the specific sequence of events in space and time that produced the specific physical evidence found by the rescue teams. The mountain does not know in any metaphysical sense. But the mountain was there, and the physical processes that occurred in and around the tent, whatever they were, left traces in the physical record of the mountain slopes and the bodies of the 9, and the fabric of the tent, and the snow that the rescuers found in February, and the investigators catalogued in the weeks that followed. Those traces are the evidence. The evidence is imperfect, collected by the standards of 1959 and partially classified for 65 years. But it exists, and it contains within it the answer to what happened, or at least the closest approximation to the answer that the physical world can provide after 6 decades of time have acted on it. The slab avalanche theory, and the infrasound theory, and the military activity theory, and the atmospheric phenomenon theory are all attempts to read that evidence into a coherent account that explains the departure from the tent, the injuries, the radioactivity, the missing features, the orange spheres. Each theory reads some of the evidence correctly and fails to read other elements. The correct theory, if there is a single correct theory, will be the one that accounts for all of it, and that theory has not yet been articulated. The possibility that the correct theory is something that has not yet been proposed, something that awaits an investigator or a set of investigators with the right combination of expertise and access and insight, is real. The Dyatlov Pass case has been approached from enough directions and by enough intelligent people that the most obvious theories have probably been developed. But the history of investigation shows that the most important insight in a case is sometimes the one that reframes the question rather than adding to the answers within the existing frame, and the Dyatlov case may still be waiting for that reframing. What is certain is that the 9 people were real, that their deaths were real, that whatever happened to them was a physical event in the physical world, and that the physical world left evidence of it that 65 years of investigation has not fully decoded. The mountain is still there. The evidence is still there, in archives and in the physical material that has been collected and analyzed and reanalyzed. Classified portions are still held by the Russian state. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old. He was a radio engineering student who made his own equipment and led his hiking club's most ambitious expeditions. He is the name on the pass because he led the group that died there, and his name has become the primary label for one of the most debated events in the history of outdoor adventure and one of the most widely known unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. He planned the expedition carefully. He selected the route and the team. He made the decision on February 1st to camp on the open slope rather than descend to the tree line. He kept, in the last diary entry of the collective journal, the specific matter-of-fact record of an experienced expedition leader noting the day's progress. He was one of the first to be found, 300 meters from the cedar tree, in the posture of someone who had fallen while trying to reach something above him on the slope. He had died of hypothermia in the cold of a February night in the northern Urals, without his boots, in the specific landscape he had chosen to lead his group through. Whatever he knew, in those last hours, about why he had left the tent and why he could not go back. He knew it in the dark, in the cold, beyond the reach of anyone who could have recorded it or transmitted it. The knowledge died with him in the snow. The mountain kept its secrets. The stars above the Ural peaks in February are very bright and very close, and the cold is the same cold it has always been, and the unknown compelling force remains, 65 years later, unknown. 9 people, 1 question, no answer. The mountain has not yet said.